today I guess we're going to talk about focus stacking. I've had quite a few people ask me recently, what is focus stacking? Or how do I get started? What do I need? So I decided to make a multi-part video tutorial to explain the basics and the methods that I've found to be the easiest to get good results. So what is focus stacking? If you're familiar with macro photography, you know that when you take a photo with extreme magnification, you get a very narrow depth of field, a thin strip of area that's in focus. As you can see here, only a small area of this image is in focus. In focus stacking, we're going to take a series of images at different focal lengths. You're going to start with the closest focus point to you, and you're going to take a picture. Then you're going to move your focus point just a little bit back and take a picture, a little bit further, take a picture, a little bit further, take a picture. You want your focus points to slightly overlap, so the lower your f value is, the more slices you're going to need to make a complete stack. So an f value of say 5.6, I'm going to need a lot more images than an f value of 11 or 13, etc. Here's an example of the image sequence in order. If you can see the focus point shift from the front of the image towards the back. So the equipment you're going to need, obviously you're going to need a camera, preferably a DSLR camera. Absolutely required equipment, a rail, a macro lens, or extension tubes for your kit lens. Optional but highly recommended is a speedlight, either a remote for your speedlight or a cable for your speedlight so that you can use it off camera. You could choose to use a ring light. I don't like them. As a flash, they're not bright enough. I've never seen one that's really bright enough. Maybe a really expensive one, but not a budget one for sure. And with continuous lighting, this just doesn't do a very good job. It's better than nothing. I used it for many years before I got my speedlight. You'll have to do longer exposures, and any shake in your table or whatever could blur your stacks. So I don't recommend using a good TTL speedlight or ETTL speedlight. Your best bet. Definitely going to want an off-camera cable though. Later in the next video I'll show you how I set it all up. I do have a set of extension tubes for my Canon. Normally I'd be using the 18 to 55 millimeter lens, but that's on my camera as we're recording right now. So I'm going to demonstrate with the 55 to 250 millimeter. If you put all three of these extension tubes on, it's a 65 millimeter tube then, and dial this into 100 millimeters, you'll get a 1-to-1 macro magnification. And if you've never seen how extension tubes work, this one's not very well marked. I have really cheap tubes, there we go. And if you want to know how they work, I recommend looking up other videos because I probably won't describe it correctly. But this will work. You'll need more light, and I've found that I got much softer images using either kit lens, the 18 to 55 or the 55 to 250. I got really soft images. When I got the Laowa 100 millimeter lens, I'm in love. It's totally manual focus, but super beautiful crisp images, and it takes in a lot of light. It does a wonderful job, as you'll see in some of the examples. And another thing about doing the extension tubes, you see it's considerably longer, it takes up a lot more space, although still with all the tubes, this is lighter than my Laowa lens. But so when it comes to rails, all rails are definitely not created equally. I own 3 rails. The first rail I ever bought was this monster. I believe it was about 30 bucks, and I've had it for 12 years or so at least. I don't know who made it. It's had many issues over the years, but it did do the job. If this is all you have or this is all you can get, it'll do the job. But for the same price as one of these, you can get something much nicer in my opinion. This has a side to side and a front to back. It does have measurements on it, but there's no marker to indicate where you are on said measurements, so they don't really do much good. And the biggest problem with this style is if you're trying to do work at a steep angle or looking down or up even, it will move under its own weight without turning the knobs, no matter how much you tighten it. And if you try to tighten it too much, the little metal piece right here collapses, and then it won't tighten anymore at all, and the whole top of it will crack and break out. I mean, it took several years for that to happen, but this is basically one of my DIY tools. I use it for projects. I never use it for macro anymore. Don't buy one, really, honestly. If you have one, it'll work, but don't. This is the second rail that I purchased. This one was $35. This is a fantastic rail in a lot of ways. It does have its issues. This one you can get much more precision movements out of. You can get tiny, tiny, tiny little movements dialed in. Much more fine-tuned than the rail I use most of the time, which would probably be really useful for higher levels of magnification beyond 2:1. However, the base that travels, essentially the carriage here, I don't know if you can hear it click. There's a little bit of play in it, and as it travels along, every so many full rotations, it'll click from one side to the other, just a tiny little bit. And at 2:1, your software, as long as you make some adjustments in your software settings, can handle the side-to-side movements as long as it's not getting skewed weirdly. But anything beyond that, I'm afraid it would be a real issue. I really like this one, and the other huge problem is the way this one connects to the camera. It uses this mechanism here, and it's super tight, hard to screw in, and then once it's on your camera tight enough, it's really difficult to get off. I'll have a review for this at some point. And that brings us to the rail I use now. This one was considerably more expensive than the other two. This one was $70, I believe. Fortunately I had some Amazon credit from a return that helped with that. This one is a 4-way, similar to the first one I showed you, and it's geared so it will not slip. You cannot push it. Basically has a geared worm drive. This one requires some maintenance when you first get it. You need to tighten up the tension points on it, but once they're tightened up, it works really, really nicely. And at least to magnifications of 2:1, this one does a really good job. I've got it pretty much down pat how far to turn it for 2:1 and how far to turn it when I'm doing 1:1. Plus, this one has the wonderful advantage of a removable Arca Swiss style plate, which makes that just #1 in my book right there, just because of that. But like I said, this one's twice as much as the other two. If you can only afford $35 or so and you're looking to just play around with it and not terribly serious, definitely give this little thing a try. This is also by Neewer. I'll put links to both of these in the description. I do not know what brand the old one is, so I won't put a link for that one. A couple things I forgot to mention before also. You're going to need a diffuser. This is the diffuser I use for my general macro photography. It mounts over the lens barrel, but I just put it in a clamp, mount that clamp somehow, you know. Sometimes I just balance it on top of everything too. I mean, just whatever you got to do to diffuse that light. A larger diffuser would be more ideal, but I don't have the room for that, or a larger diffuser at the moment. Another thing you're going to need for sure is some kind of continuous lighting source, preferably in the 5500K range for the color spectrum, so that it's a close match to your flash. You'll want to use this as low a setting as you can, where you can see clearly to focus and you get enough light for your software to use the focus peaking. but you don't want it to be so bright as to overpower your flash. You'll get muddy results. And the last thing I really recommend is a power supply for your camera. This will save you huge amounts of frustration when your batteries go dead in the middle of a shoot, which happened to me frequently while I was learning. And then, having to unmount your camera and change the batteries, you can't mount the camera back exactly where it was, so pretty much your stack is trash. You can start all over again. So make sure your batteries are full or you have a power supply. And then I guess we need to talk about software. I use Helicon Remote and Helicon Focus. I got them both on sale, bundled together for like 45 bucks. It's $45 a year, I guess. It's not expensive, it's totally worthwhile, and you can get a 30-day free trial of them both. Aside from Helicon Focus, for live view to do your stacks, you can also use Digicam Control, which is absolutely free, and it works great. I like it for taking manual stacks. I never figured out how to get it to control the autofocus on a lens, but I don't use autofocus anymore for my stacks anyway. I may get into that sometime in the future, but probably not in this tutorial. As far as compiling your stacks, Helicon Focus is going to be the absolute best one I've used for compiling. I've tried Zareen Stack, and I wasn't happy with the results from it compared to Helicon. Up until recently, I mostly did my stacking in Affinity Photo, and it does a really good job handling more complex stacks, but it softens and you lose a little bit of detail compared to Helicon Focus. And Helicon Focus handles really complex stuff very, very well. And you can also, of course, stack in Photoshop, but I've never been satisfied with the results from Photoshop. It does preserve more detail, but it does a terrible job determining the background generally. The background ends up really blocky. It requires lots of fixing. And overlapping sections and intersecting lines tend to get screwed up, and it's much more difficult to repair in Photoshop, in my opinion, than it is with Helicon Focus. So I highly recommend you use Helicon Focus. My tutorial is going to primarily focus on Helicon Focus and Helicon Remote. And I may touch on how to compile the stacks in Affinity Photo and in Photoshop.